Hello, everybody. Welcome to this CCC webinar. Okay, so for today, my name is Tristano Bacundio. I'm the marketing manager of the Cloud Credential Council. As I said before, we are lucky today because we are in the company of the two main authors of the Cloud Technology Associate syllabus. So we have Sudhakar Nagazampagi. He's a 25-year plus IT professional, accredited master trainer for the Cloud Credential Council. He's an international speaker, he's a trainer, he's a course author, he's a blogger about cloud and cloud security, has been working also on recently on Resilia courseware. He's a project manager professional, and he holds ITIL Foundation certification and much more. He currently provides training in the areas of cloud computing and virtualization, in which he maintains numerous certifications that I'm not going to list them all here. He also provides training in IT security and cloud security. He's the lead author and master trainer for the Cloud Credential Council Cloud Technology Associate course. Together with him, we have Peter Van Eyck. He's a PhD super expert in cloud security, and he develops and delivers workshops for swift and secure cloud adoption. He has worked for Deloitte Consulting, IT supplier, ADS, internet providers, and with the University of Twente in the Netherlands, where he received his PhD back in the 90s. He is also the co-author for the Cloud Credential Council Cloud Technology Associate certification syllabus. That is, if you are out of cloud, you're out of work. What does it mean? That this is coming from an interview we ran with Peter Van Eyck, I think 1 year ago. And the point is that we understood that every job role is impacted by cloud computing. So we want to introduce today the key skills to move into cloud.
Really, the cloud is a revolution in IT, and one of the slides I was going to show you, which is coming up in a second, is about the big shift in IT. Way back we had mainframes and there were single computers with a lot of people, and then the PC came along and then we turned into client-server work. Let's see, can I actually move this? Yeah, I can. Okay, good. Right, this is the slide I was going to show you. And then beyond that, we had more internet connectivity, and in that world we started to have what's called data center snowflakes, where individual machines would be finely tweaked and tuned, and it took weeks to set up, and then they couldn't be changed, and then sometimes they couldn't be changed for years in end. Then we moved to virtualization and cloud, and that's kind of where we are right now, where you can spin up servers on demand, either in your own data center or as you move along to cloud in the cloud world. And that really speeds up the development of IT, the deployment of IT. And that has business benefits. So the big reason why cloud has become successful is because it drives business benefit. And one of the #1 things there is not that it's cheaper, because in a lot of situations it is not cheaper, but because it's so much faster. And that gives business opportunities where you can act faster than the business requires you. So right now we're somewhere around virtualization and cloud, but if we progress the development of cloud computing and to its extreme, and by applying the same principles of elasticity, flexibility, self-provisioning, etc., etc., then we're moving further right to the scale. The next thing up that we already see happening is Docker containers, which is, and Sudhakar will talk a little bit about that, and talk about that in a little bit more detail later on, where you deploy stuff not in minutes but in seconds, and stuff that will be live for only a couple of hours, and then it gets scaled up and down again. And way beyond that, there is something called AWS Lambda, and there's a few people use that, but big organizations are definitely not there yet. Big organizations are now somewhere around cloud, and sometimes they're when they're advanced, they're using containers. Tristano was mentioning ING Bank, the people that actually started the Cloud Essentials training, because they had a vision 5 years ago that that was the way to go. And they were using that model to really change, to turn around their IT infrastructure and application development teams. That's why they wanted to have this course to train all their staff on cloud computing concepts. And if you search for ING and agile development, you'll find a couple of very interesting YouTube videos that shows how far they have come. I talk to these people on a regular basis, especially in Docker communities, and the value that these people are getting out of this is just immense. It's incredible. They've turned themselves from an old-fashioned bank into what is effectively a cloud provider. So cloud is the big business benefit, and to sum it up, the big benefit of cloud is actually that you're speeding up the platform and that you're increasing feature velocity. And that enables a lot of good business things. And Sudhakar will talk also about additional concepts such as DevOps and a few other that's around that, and cloud native applications. But that's really the biggest business benefit that I keep hearing from people. So how does this bear out in the market? Let me try and give you some perspective on that. So here we have some statistics on how the market is moving. Now, obviously, as you all know, you guys have been into this a little for a while already. Cloud and distributed computing are the hottest skills, were the hottest skills in 2015, and they still are. Now, depending how you slice and dice it, it looks a little bit different. So, I mean, in LinkedIn, it was sliced in a different way. If you look at what people are actually looking for, according to Computer World this year, you see IT architecture, programming, application development, big data, and a lot of these things really take a new world in cloud. Now, especially IT architecture. If you don't architect for cloud, then you're basically shooting yourself in the foot. Then you're making yourself really slow as an organization. And on the right-hand side, it continues into security and governance, because we're outsourcing more and more to cloud providers. Now, of course, you have to interpret this a little bit, because really the way these surveys work is that there is a set of categories, and then people sort of hit on the categories. And if you take different categories, you get a slightly different perspective, although the underlying trend is obviously still the same. However, to take the left side with a grain of salt, what you see is cloud/SaaS. Apparently, the people that were creating this thought that cloud was only SaaS. Well, it's not. I mean, if you combine cloud and distributed computing, it looks very much different. Now, most important for our discussion today is what are the cloud challenges? And what you see is that gray is 2015, blue is 2016. Lack of resources and expertise is actually a big thing. That's, in a way, that's weird. So we have more and more people who understand this. At the same time, the demand for these resources seems to increase even faster. Then, of course, we're getting security and compliance still as a #1 concern, although other surveys sort of see that leveling out. I'm not that sure. And the only thing that seems to be going down is a concern around performance. Well, that's definitely, in the cloud, that's really easy. I mean, cloud is performant, period. So that's just one set of statistics and surveys on the market. And it's all pointing in one direction, and that is that you need to understand cloud if you want to advance in IT. That's the punchline here. So to underline this further, another forecast. What are the most important projects that their IT departments are or should be working on? Again, cloud computing is on the top. Security technologies is obviously related, because security is a hot topic. And what we see these days also is that there is a strong interconnection between security and cloud. People are worrying about security in the cloud, but they're also seeing cloud as a way to get more secure. Then, of course, legacy system modernization. Now, where do you think that those legacy systems are going to? To their own data center? Unlikely. A lot of companies are stating publicly that their plan is to close down all their data centers in 5 years from now. And if you don't believe that, just go to the recordings of the last Amazon Web Services Invent conference, and you see big financial firms making those statements. So why are people doing this? Here is the interesting one. On the right-hand side, IT needs to be better, right? And IT needs to create new revenue. It's not fixing old problems. It is rejuvenating IT. And this is, of course, it doesn't really show very well from this statistic. But if we talk to ING and all other people that for instance, think about Docker and SaaS services, it's like, okay, we can't afford to do it the old way anymore. It's just too slow. It's too expensive. We're not getting the agility that we need. So again, a perspective on cloud and cloud security to some extent, because you can't say the word cloud without using the word security a little later on somehow. So where are companies? Now let's take a look.
We have a question from the audience.
Ah, good. Yeah, I can't see the question, so you have to interrupt me. Yeah, please.
So, how do you separate cloud, SaaS from these other areas? And he's referring from the hot skill in the market slide. It was 2 slides ago, I believe.
Yes. I remember the slide. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the survey itself. And I still get, I run a lot of webinars and training sessions, and a lot of times people come into the training thinking that, yeah, I kind of know what cloud is, and then you go around the table and ask everybody what they think is cloud, and it's all different. And that's really interesting, and this happens all the time. People think they know what cloud is because I don't want to sound negative, but they read a couple of papers and articles in the newspapers. But cloud, there's an underlying theory to cloud that is actually very well thought out, and that has strong applicability, because the theory actually predicts which cloud provider is better than another cloud provider. Now, at the same time, you have this SaaS, PaaS, and infrastructure thing, and that is also confusing for a lot of people. It has to do with how much do you outsource. Well, I can't really explain that in a lot of detail right now, so Sudhakar will pick up on some of that later in this session. But really, that's what Cloud Technology Associated is about. It's about what are the essential definitions of cloud, and if you truly understand that, then you would probably write slightly better surveys. I don't want to sound too, advanced, but that's each survey is different because the journalists also have a, let's say, have their own perspective on the world. So let's get. I hope that answers the question. If not, please ask another one. Let's see where we are. So in this slide, we see that between 2015 2016, that the overall maturity of organizations is actually increasing. And the only category that's shrinking, and interestingly enough, is that of the cloud watchers that say, well, we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. And that has sort of separated into the people who are actually doing it and the people who decide, no, we're not going to do this. And there's a valid reason for some companies to do that. So what you see is that there is no company that has not moved to the cloud. Well, there's hardly any company that has moved to the cloud. There are companies that are moving a ton of things to the cloud, and even mission-critical enterprise applications. That is definitely the trend, and the trend is straight into more cloud. It's not into less cloud. But cloud is a complicated beast in that respect. It sounds easy when you get going on it, but in reality, it's a little bit more complicated. Maybe it's like raising children or driving a car. It all sounds so easy, and everybody knows how to do it. But when you're really into it, you go like, "Oh, I wasn't expecting this." But you get the hang of it if you move in a little further. So that was the wrong button. I think I've covered the section that I was planning to do. Are there any additional questions, Tristana, or do you have a point of clarification, because I may have been telling this a little bit too often, and I may have skipped some of the more important points in this area.
I think everything was clear. I would like now to ask Sudhakar if he has some points, some remarks about this part of the presentation as well. Sudhakar, can you hear me? Do you have anything you would like to add here? Yes, perhaps observation from your own experience?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Tristano. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you good.
Okay, good. Basically, I just wanted to add one or 2 points. As mentioned in Peter's presentation, the number one challenge in cloud today is not security. It has been replaced by lack of resources and expertise. And to gain expertise, it is very essential to take up course training as well as certification. So that is an important factor to note, that there is a lot of demand for cloud skills in the market, and to have the necessary expertise, the skills, as well as training and certification are a must. The second point I would like to just mention here is the trend today is that in the state of cloud, there is more of hybrid clouds that organizations are moving to. Yes, private clouds and public clouds are being utilized, but it's the role of hybrid clouds that's increasing in greater demand. So these are my 2 observations which I have seen in the corporate organizations.
Okay. And Peter, we have another question. Basically,
yeah, sure. Shoot.
Is asking if is the approach to cloud security now more clear, or how did it seem to be broken down? Like, basically,
sorry,
the question.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is basically if there's a clear path on how to approach cloud security nowadays.
Yes, there is, and of course it's an entire body of knowledge in and of itself. We do understand cloud security much better these days than a couple of years ago. However, once again, it's not something that you slap on and okay, put a band-aid on. To do secure computing in the cloud requires a ton of work. The good news is it can be done. It has been demonstrated to be done. Cloud providers can actually help you do that in a much better way than we used to be able to do. The bad news is it's more and more necessary to do that because the threat landscape is more complicated, and there are also a ton of providers out there who are not good enough. So you really need to understand cloud security in significant amount of detail. In the CTA course, we have a full chapter on cloud security and the specific threats that need to be worked on. And in the entire curriculum, there is additional material on cloud security. So there are answers, but you have to do the work.
Okay, Peter, we have another question.
By the way, I was one comment that I need to make. The speeding up the platform picture was actually from the guy who used to be the CTO of Netflix, and that's Adrian Cockcroft. So I don't want to give you the impression that I created that slide. That if you really want to understand cloud and its agility, then search for Adrian Cockcroft on Netflix, because he really was way ahead of everybody else. Over to you.
Peter, we have another question.
Okay, good.
They want to know from this slide, who are the 20% that are not moving to the cloud? I mean, we didn't create this slide. We took this from Computer World. But like basically, then they are adding, are they made of those who have tried and failed, or have decided that their business doesn't need to go to the cloud? What do you think? What's your opinion about it?
There's a couple of points there. First of all, there are a couple of companies that are fairly well established in their current IT, and that are like if you think about a chemical plant that's in the middle of nowhere, it is very unlikely that will have any benefit from cloud. So there are definitely cases where you say, well, we can't really do this, we can't really afford it, it doesn't really make any sense from the business perspective that we have. So there's definitely an element to that. A lot of public government seems to think that way, and for a large part of their organization, it actually makes sense for a while. On the other hand, it depends on who you ask. I mean, if you ask IT professionals, especially if you ask the wrong IT professionals, the ones that are entrenched into their data center on the top of the hill with the big fortress, they may not be aware of the fact that the other half of their organization is actually already moving into the cloud. So that's another perspective there. We see both things happen. There are companies that have valid reasons to currently not go to cloud, but more often than not, it is a lack of visibility into what's going on. You know, I had a great story about it. Even 3-4 years ago, there was an insurance company and that some of these guys came to my class and said, yeah, well, I need to know more about cloud because we officially don't do cloud. But I asked I was a security guy, of course. I asked the procurement department how many cloud services we were using. And the procurement department, mind you, the procurement department officially knew about 200 cloud services. And this was an insurance company 3 years ago. So the IT department was totally unaware of that. The procurement department was aware of that. And this probably does not include all the cloud services that were totally under the radar in the company. So that's definitely a side of the story that's there as well. I hope it answers the question, and compliment the asker for having the question, and do let me know if there are any follow-up questions on that, either now or later in this session.
Okay, thank you. Now we will move forward to key skills for stepping into the cloud. So this is Sudhakar's turn. Sudhakar, I'm going to give you the control of the keyboard.
Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome everybody, and thanks, Peter, for all the insights that you have provided. It's a really
You're welcome.
Yeah, session that we enjoyed, and yes. So today's webinar, we will focus on some of the aspects of the Cloud Technology Associate course. What are the various modules in the course, as well as certain aspects in some of the courses. One of the questions that I generally ask during training courses is, what is different from cloud as compared to traditional IT, or why has cloud suddenly risen into prominence? What is it that the traditional IT cannot manage, or there are challenges in traditional IT? And when I ask this question to many of them, they come up with just 3 or 4 options, one of them being costs. They are very much clear about the concept of cloud being relatively less costlier than the traditional IT infrastructure. Second is scalability and flexibility and maintenance. A few of these are what they generally come up with. But in fact, there are many more. And I would just be going through each of these aspects to bring in more detail about what could be the challenges and how we can overcome them by moving to the cloud. The first challenge is in the high upfront investment, which we categorize as capital and operational expenses, or also known as CAPEX in the cloud terminology. So what does high upfront investment mean? In the sense that in an enterprise or an organization, they have to allocate space for the IT department, and then they need to have a separate server room, all with proper air conditioning and heating, cooling, and then they have to have all the storage, the networks, the admins, the commissioning, all these aspects. And for this, you have to have a lot of investment upfront, which only major corporations, organizations, or companies can afford. As compared to, on the other hand, with cloud computing, we can say there's practically no investment at all. It is categorized something as only operational expenses, because all the upfront investment and all the capital are borne by the cloud service providers, and they have invested heavily into creating various data centers across the world. So the cloud computing is restricted to more of operational based expenses, and we call that as OPEX. Second factor that we come across in traditional computing, which is a challenge, is the provisioning. If a IT department needs to develop a critical project, and that project has to be developed on a isolated server. Now, to provision a server of that kind would take approximately 30 to 45 days in a corporate environment. Right from the moment a request is being made for getting the server till it is commissioned and fully operational for use. On the other hand, in cloud computing, there is a factor of self-provisioning where you can create what we call as virtual machines or an instance or virtual servers in a matter of minutes. So within a couple of minutes, like 2 to 3 minutes, you should be able to get your virtual machines as good as a virtual server or a computer, in fact, which has got an operating system and an application installed, and you can start working on it within a matter of minutes. So there's a big difference in the way provisioning state is achieved in cloud as compared to traditional computing. And this is a major factor or a major challenge in traditional, where the cloud can easily overcome that particular scenario. So moving on to the next slide, we have other factors. One being that in traditional computing, it is not easy to scale. It's not easily scalable. Both the application, the databases, especially the databases which are relational databases. So there is a limit to the type of scalability that can be achieved. Whereas in cloud computing, we have now a different mechanism of not only storing data in relational database systems, but also in different object-based storages. So we have NoSQL, we have NewSQL kind of storage systems which can cater to various audios and videos, messages, or blobs, texts of different kinds. So, and these are very highly scalable. So it is a factor that has to be matching with today's demand, with the ever-increasing requirement that everybody wants things to be done within the next couple of minutes, or rather it should have been done yesterday-like. So scalability is a very important factor that is easily achievable in the cloud, whereas the same cannot be done in the traditional way of computing. Moving on, we have capacity. So in a traditional computing, an organization starts its IT department with a peak load basis capacity. They fix up on the peak load that they have achieved during their study of a couple of months or a couple of years. And on that, they start fixing up their capacity. And then as the demand grows, they start increasing their capacity, which is not a very flexible manner that can scale in or out or up and down. Whereas in cloud computing, the flexibility is very much in hand. So it's very elastic. And because of the elasticity property, scalability can be achieved very fast. And scalability comes in different forms. We have scaling out, where we increase the number of virtual machines or instances, or we can scale up also, where we can increase the size of an instance or a virtual machine, so that it can cater to more CPU power or more memory cores and so on. The limitation to scaling up is that you can scale up only to a certain size, whereas in scaling out, it is termed as you can create as many virtual machines as possible. I mean, practically infinite, but definitely there is a limit for organizations to work on that capacity, because remember that for each virtual machine or instance that is running, it is accumulating costs or it's accruing costs. So costs are being associated, and unless you're not using those wisely, it becomes a big bill to foot at the later stages of the development. Another factor we are going to look at is dedicated hardware, which is mostly the case in traditional computing. and a separate environment is required for each organization to manage their hardware. And here, the concept of server utilization. In traditional computing, we say utilization of all the resources is barely about 10 to 15%, because most of these resources are generally used during the peak hours of the weekdays for about 5 hours in the whole day, say some from 10 to 12 in the working day in the morning and between 2 to 4 in the afternoon. The rest of the time, the resources are not very much highly used, and definitely not in the evenings or nights or during the weekends. So utilization as compared to the investment is very poor in traditional computing. In the case of cloud computing, it's a shared model. We have a concept called as, or a characteristic of cloud saying resource pooling. So we share resources. We have the technology of virtualization, which is a backbone technology for cloud, and that creates multiple virtual servers from a single physical server through a software virtualization layer called as a hypervisor. So using this resource sharing characteristic, hardware is generally utilized by many organizations through virtual machines, and therefore it is definitely a much cheaper and inexpensive way to manage. Plus, the resource utilization is much higher, because the moment you do not need a particular instance or a virtual machine, you can shut it down or terminate it. So you can just utilize your virtual machine for the tasks that you're running, and after that you can easily let go of the virtual machine without incurring further costs. So the resource utilization in a cloud computing environment is envisaged to be around 70 to 85% as compared to 10 to 15% in a traditional computing environment. Moving further, in traditional computing, you actually pay for the actual capacity that you have built into the department or into the IT infrastructure, which could be probably very high, whereas in cloud computing, it's a utility-based model. So you pay just for use, similar to an electricity or a water billing, where you just pay at the end of the month for the actual usage that you have occurred during the particular month. So coming to that aspect, if the actual definitely is much more viable rather than paying for something that has not been utilized fully or properly, and that is definitely a very good advantage in cloud computing. It's also one of the essential characteristics of cloud computing. In traditional computing, we have management through general system admins who have control over the entire infrastructure, and they need to provide role-based access. They grant permissions or deny permissions. They control practically many of the aspects in both application level or the database level or the environment level. Whereas in cloud computing, it's a characteristic of on-demand self-service. So moving more towards automation, managed with APIs, and the self-service gives authority where you do not need the assistance of a third-party provider or a customer call center, and the on-demand aspect gives you the time that you can access the service, a cloud service, anytime, anywhere from the world, as long as you can get a hand to a browser or an internet connection. Traditional computing also has less or practically no disaster recovery aspects. Many corporations or organizations have very few disaster recovery structures set up, and even if they do have that set up, they are unable to test it effectively. And what happens is when a disaster occurs, there can be a lot of downtime, and of course the business can be affected, profits can go down, and it's all again a spiral effect. Whereas in cloud computing, the disaster recovery and high availability, disaster recovery and high availability are built-in within the cloud environment. So the cloud service provider in a public cloud, for example, takes care of the entire replication or resiliency characteristics of the cloud, which enable this disaster recovery and high availability features. In traditional computing further, there's a very low agility because most of the focus is set up on delivering, doing the IT department and getting the necessary infrastructure, the licensing, the software, the administration, the maintenance, and so on. And the same as compared to cloud computing, most of the underweight lifting can be related to the cloud service provider or can be transferred to the service provider, whereas the organization itself can focus more on its core business. So therefore, there's a better agility prospects in cloud computing. And in the last comparison factor, we say that in a traditional computing, there can be costs associated with electricity and cooling and other infrastructure related maintenance, whereas in cloud computing, it's more of towards green computing, a trend towards green computing, where it can translate to lesser costs. So these are several such factors that we have seen that can be utilized more in the cloud in a better manner than in a traditional way of computing. So moving on to what you can learn the CCC certification and how it can be used in the workplace to address shifting to the cloud. So CCC certification is based on various concepts or the fundamentals of cloud computing. The CTA course actually is divided into 7 different modules. I will go through each of these aspects of these modules, but basically I would just like to mention one thing here. The CTA course focuses on many different concepts, and these concepts of fundamentals of cloud are an essential part to going into building a career in the cloud. I've seen many organizations where they have started working directly on, say, Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure or Google, and then they are directly involved with how to create the services and start utilizing them. But their concepts or the fundamentals of basic cloud computing is practically very less. In fact, many of them, if I ask them the word cloud, what does the word cloud mean, or what is the metaphor of the word cloud, many are still unable to answer that particular question. They can all answer the question for what is cloud computing, but if you ask them what does the cloud mean, they are still unable to answer such questions. So basic questions starting from what is the cloud, what are the characteristics, essential characteristics, what are the different forms of scaling. These are aspects that have to be understood so that you can apply them properly while designing, architecting, or implementing within the cloud. So in the CTA course, we have the first module, which is a brief introduction about the course and the objectives and what participants can aim to achieve at the end of this particular full course. The second course begins with an introduction to, begins with an introduction to cloud computing. And this module covers the widely adopted National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is by short called as NIST, definition of cloud computing. This definition of cloud computing is widely adopted by many organizations in the world. If you ask thousands of people what is the definition of cloud computing, you would be given probably thousands of different answers. There's no one single definition of cloud computing that anybody goes by. But NIST definition or the Gartner's definition or the ISO's definition of cloud computing are some of the prominent ones. And the NIST definition of cloud computing is the most widely accepted, even by Amazon Web Services and Microsoft and Google. So it is a widely adopted definition, and it includes the 5 essential characteristics of the cloud, which are the on-demand self-service, broad network access, then we have resource pooling, rapid elasticity, and measured service, along with the service models, which most of you are familiar with, the SaaS, the PaaS, and the IaaS models, and the various deployment models, the public, the private, the community, and the hybrid clouds. This module also highlights the various benefits and challenges in cloud computing and also mentions major cloud actors. Now, this is some concept that not many are aware of. Everybody feels that there's just a service provider and a consumer, but there are a cloud auditor, and a cloud auditor's report is very important while selecting a service provider. So cloud auditor, cloud brokerage, or a cloud broker, a cloud carrier are some of the major actors. Various terminologies are also introduced here, such as replication or the various backups that a service provider keeps within a particular data center or a region, or across data centers or regions in the world. So a factor called as geo-replication, which again is a cost affecting factor, whereas the simple replication is free by default. Then resiliency, which is a failover.
Second.
Yes?
Yeah, so you mentioned quickly SAS, PAS, YAS, all these strange acronyms for the non-expert. But we got a question from the audience, and they would like to know briefly what is the difference and how to very quickly select an internet service provider in order to get the best of
basically, the SAS, PAS, and IS. So SAS is the least technically required skills. It is a model for where end users can make use of using an application as it is. So something like the social media, where people are using, say, Facebook, Twitter, or you have LinkedIn, you have YouTube, Dropbox. These are all kind of specific SaaS applications where all your emails, your Gmail, Yahoo Mail, or Hotmail, whatever you have, these are all basically SaaS applications which can be used as it is, but you have no control over where the application or the data resides. So this is taken care of entirely by the service provider, who has full control of everything and manages all the replication and the backup copies. Whereas the SaaS, since it is just an application you can use as it is with very little customization, so it requires very less skills and generally is meant for the public or the end users. The PaaS model, or the platform as a service, is more focused towards developers or programmers who are well versed with at least one programming language. So maybe it's Java, .NET, PHP, or Ruby on Rails, Python, whatever. So they can focus on developing an application and web application, or a database-based application, or an e-commerce site, such as making use of databases such as SQL Server, MySQL, or Oracle, and so on. So skills with certain development as well as in core technologies should be required for developing in PaaS model, and generally focusing on developers and programmers. So any application that you need to integrate with your organization will generally fall under this category. The third model, or the IS model, is generally one which requires the most skills, technical skills, especially that of virtualization. And unless one is well aware of what virtualization stands or means, it's not wise to start working on directly with IS. So IS is generally meant for operations, or people who want to create backups and they want to do CDNs or any of these kinds of things. They could start working on the IS-based technologies, which requires definitely a lot of technologies-based knowledge, such as virtualization, as I just mentioned. Okay, fine. So major actors and terminologies such as replication resiliency, vendor lock-in, exit strategy are all a part of this module, explained in depth with various examples. Moving on, we have module 3, which introduces the concepts of virtualization. The virtualization is definitely considered the backbone technology of cloud computing. There are various types of virtualization, the advantages of virtualization, plus this module also contains a demo of creating and managing virtual machines. either using Amazon Web Services or OpenStack in the cloud. So this demo generally gives the participant a practical understanding of how the cloud services work. So this is a total module only devoted towards the concepts of virtualization and its various types. Moving on, module 4, you have things like bring your own device or software-defined networking, a new trend now in networking aspects. We have network functions virtualization, big data, NoSQL and NewSQL storage systems, and now the rapidly evolving Internet of Things. So these are some of the technologies that are now being looked into, which can interact with the cloud, and skills for these also are in demand. So moving on to the next module. Module 5 is based on cloud security, risk, compliance, and governance. So extensively, this module covers or delves into the challenges faced by cloud computing while considering the services and deployment models, plus their impact on business value and risk. So common attack vectors are identified, remediating controls are also considered and recommended. So you get an overall quick view of what the challenges in cloud security look like. Moving on, we have module 6, which focuses on the aspects of preparing for cloud adoption. So an enterprise needs to identify which applications or architecture solutions, various organizational capabilities, migration approaches, the roles and responsibilities of service providers and their dependencies should all factor while trying to go to a successful adoption of cloud computing services. So this module extensively focuses on which types of applications and which types of solutions that one should focus on in various scenarios. The last module, module 7, which is the last module of the course, introduces the NIST concepts, architecture, actors, and life cycle of cloud service management, such as we have business support and life cycle of cloud service management, such as business support, provisioning and configuration, and portability and interoperability. Several cloud management products are also included in this part of the course, and therefore you can relate to those cloud management products, which are now becoming more costlier in advancing time. So cloud management is also an important factor that one should focus on. Moving on, we look at some real world scenarios where we, based on the concepts learned during the course. Hybrid clouds, as I said earlier, is a major trend these days. Many of the organizations or corporations are moving towards making full use of hybrid clouds, where sensitive and confidential data can be stored in a private cloud of the organization and non-sensitive data can be moved to a public cloud. Also, there is a specific phenomena of the hybrid clouds called as the cloud bursting phenomena. So, in a couple of years ago, two of the Indian major retailers announced their first billionth day sale. These retailers were Flipkart and Snapdeal. Unfortunately, it all resulted in very disastrous results or performances. The demand was very huge on these days, and the sites just could not cope up with the demand and was up and down, going down several times a day. They had probably envisioned or planned of using this particular phenomenon of cloud bursting and the hybrid cloud, there would not have been such major issues. Another aspect of is in order to implement business continuity in various organizations, disaster recovery and a better performance or reducing latency specifically. Service providers such as Amazon, Microsoft, Google have built data centers in various regions of the world and now support it with content delivery networks which cache all the necessary images, all the content, static content, as well as huge image loads of videos and other files. Amazon itself has 12 such regions and nearly 54 CDNs in the world today. New technologies such as big data, NoSQL, storage systems, and Internet of Things are being supported by many service providers. AWS, for example, uses Hadoop and DynamoDB and IoT, whereas Microsoft has started making use of HD Insight, DocumentDB, and the IoT suite for managing all these new emerging technologies. Enterprises are now using stronger security mechanisms to access the cloud. We have strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, we have federated identity, which includes single sign-on, end-to-end homomorphic encryption, etc. So the CCCCTS certification, it basically tests participants on their understanding of cloud computing concepts, the application of these principles in the organizations that they work for. Actually, organizations and certified individuals get fully geared to select the right service provider and develop a proper exit strategy so that they are not locked into one proprietary service. They can also select the right cloud service and deployment models so that resources are scaled and utilized efficiently. Here, even so that they can be utilized efficiently and effectively. Invest into the appropriate cloud service and deployment models and other services so that cost savings and security are balanced timely. They should also be able to test disaster recovery systems and make use of high availability and fault tolerance features. So, having learned all these fundamental concepts, these are some of the aspects that the CCC certification can be utilized in the workplace and can properly be made full utilization in the roles that all the participants have achieved. So that completes this part of my presentation, and if there are questions, I would certainly like to welcome them.
Okay, Sudhakar, thank you very much for your extensive presentation and for introducing to the audience all the Credential PPA certification. So, Peter, can you hear me? I have a question for you actually from the audience.
Yes, I'm available. Yeah.
So basically the question is if the biggest challenge, as is recognized in the cloud nowadays, is security, and they want to know if there's no one governing or ruling the whole process. Like, is there an authority deciding what does it mean to adopt proper cloud security measures, or is still vague?
That's a very, very good question, and there's two sides to the answers. The bad news is that there is no, let's say, no single level of cloud security that's appropriate to everyone, in the same way that there is no single level of building security that's appropriate to everybody. It really depends on the environment where you are. You know, an airport has to be secured in a much different way than a supermarket or a school, and that's even depending on the geography of where you are. And I mean, if you're living in a tsunami zone, you have different requirements than where you're living in the mountains. So that's the bad news side of it. You really have to understand your own, let's say, risk profile and risk appetite to know what is the most appropriate answer. Well, having said that, there are a significant number of controls and measures and insights available to give structure to this discussion, because in the end it's a risk decision. So you say, well, as a business we accept a certain risk because we understand what can happen. Now, for example, if you're a bank, then your core banking system that processes millions of transactions on a daily basis really needs to be very, very stable. And you don't really want to jeopardize that by randomly going to cloud. On the other hand, if you would be doing some new stuff, like crunching a lot of data that you currently can't handle, then the fact that you're putting it in at a cloud provider that may be secure, but you're not so much sure about the availability or even your understanding of the service is a little less risky. So that's the overall story there. Then in more specific terms, there are a number of frameworks for cloud security. The Cloud Security Alliance has produced a lot of a large body of knowledge. We see ISO catching up a little bit onto that, and then you'll have specific industries that have specific answers to this question. For example, if you handle credit card data, then PCI DSS has extended their requirements to also include cloud providers. So that's the more or less the answer. And if you really want to see how mature that is, then you would do well to go to the websites of, let's say, of large prominent cloud providers, either infrastructure or platform or software as a service, and look up their section on compliance and risk management, and you'll see that they have a ton of certifications, and it might also be interesting to see which certifications they have. So that's kind of like the state of cloud security, risk management, and governance. If you want to know more, you have to dive deeper into all the specific areas that require a more control. And there's a couple of things that are, you know, old school, or in a way like old stories in a new way, but there are also a couple of things that really are specific to cloud, so that you have to address in a new way. And we don't have the time to discuss that in a lot of detail here, but no, there's enough for you guys to study and apply in the near future.
Thanks. I have some questions from the audience. And yeah, first of all, would you recommend vendor-neutral training or technical training first? What is the more common in reality?
Well, who's going to answer that?
Peter, you're welcome.
Okay, well, again, the answer always is a bit contextual, and it depends on your role and where your business is in the path to cloud. If you're just getting started and you think, well, let's see if we can improve the business by applying cloud technology, then you would not have made a choice for a specific technology, which means that vendor-neutral training will give you the wider perspective that allows you to make sound choices and selections for the direction to take. Because then you are in a cloud strategy / discovery phase, and the first question that you need to answer is, are we going for a SaaS model or for an infrastructure model or something in between? And only after you've decided on that does it make sense to have a look at specific vendors. Now, you may come from a different perspective. You go, for example, if you would say, hey, we have an aging Microsoft Exchange environment for 10,000 staff, and we really need to fix that quickly, then basically, if there aren't any other situations, you probably would go for a Microsoft solution, and it does make sense to go for the training that comes with that specific solution. However, having said that, you still have to worry about your compliance and risk management around that. And if you have decided, well, let's go for, or if you are already into significant development with a specific provider, and let's face it, 8 out of 10 are using Amazon Web Services, then you probably, then a significant part of your training is probably best spent on understanding the technology before you make any expensive mistakes there. So that's kind of the high level, a bit of the ballpark that's going on. Where are you in your cloud roadmap? That really drives the kind of training. And the further down you are into specific technology choices that you have made, the more likely it is to go for vendor neutral training. Of course, I mean, I'm a vendor neutral guy myself, so I am biased. You know, it's from my perspective, everybody should start with really understanding cloud concepts very well. But I understand that sometimes, you know, the practical necessities and the priorities of day-to-day work you know, may dictate otherwise. I hope. Please let me know if that is a sufficient answer for this particular question.
Sudhakar, do you have something to say? Like, in your personal experience, have you seen more people taking first technological certification and then going for a vendor neutral training, or vice versa? What's your opinion about it?
Yeah, I would advocate that definitely one should try and start with vendor neutral training and the concepts to understand what the cloud ecosystem is all about. Because I have faced issues while delivering training courses in organizations who have adopted a specific technology-based private cloud. And when I start talking about terms such as scaling out or scaling in, or if you say something about vendor lock-in or cloud bursting, I mean, they're all blank. So I have to again go back to the basics to clear these fundamentals with them. And it becomes a deviation from the agenda itself. So learning the whole ecosystem of the cloud, who are the major actors, what are the terminologies associated, it's a very essential part of building up your knowledge about the cloud. And then once you have the fundamental concepts cleared, I'm sure one can take up any specific technology to work with and then master or expertise in that particular field.
Thank you, Sudhakar. So, and Peter, what do you think? How important is to diversify your training? So, for example, are there components that any cloud professional will need to be cloud qualified? And which one? So, for example, I will imagine security is the most important, probably. Network, data storage, virtualization. What are the core components of a cloud expert?
Okay, a very good question, and I kind of want to strengthen Sudhakar's point here, and that is, if you really need to understand the core concepts of cloud before it makes any sense to get into a wider discussion. If you can't tell software from platform or public from private, then really any other discussion around the value that it has to the business is going to be severely limited. You know, and adding to the example that Sudhakar gave, what I noticed that is that, well, I'm not particularly picking on VMware because the same thing happens with similar technologies, but I see a lot of people that regard, let's say, okay, we have VMware, so we have a private cloud. And that is a severely limited approach. If you don't come from the perspective, okay, what is our cloud end state, then you'll be playing around and automating the old school concepts instead of rethinking them from an agile perspective. So the number one would truly be to understand those core concepts, and the next thing around will be to have some basic understanding of security and governance, in the sense that you are capable of discussing who's going to do. I mean, security and governance are like two things. Like the two major things are who's doing what. It's like a rap song. It's like, what do I do? What do you do? And what do I do if you don't? And if you don't understand that, in any discussion, you're able to figure out if you're a very technical person. So, I'm having an echo from somebody who's on the speaker.
I'll try to mute myself.
Yeah, that's why I have a headphone.
Yeah, okay. But anyway, Sudhakar, I have a question for you right now. Like, personally, what would you take as a development path if you were into the certification market? Or I mean, if you want to take some trainings, what will be your ideal path to become a sufficient cloud expert?
Yeah, of course, I would look at something like the CTA course or equivalent, because I need to understand all concepts or all the terminologies at least associated with cloud computing. Based on this, further I would want to work with hands-on on some of the features with certain services that are being provided as a trial basis. So Amazon Web Services or Microsoft or Google all provide a certain limited time period where you can start working on the cloud and trying to find out how it really works. And having had the hands-on experience for a while, I would then go into focusing on a more specific specific professional level course. Say for if it's a development path I'm looking at, I would look to go for the CCC Cloud Developers Professional course.
Okay, thank you very much. And Peter, another question for you. What is the future of cloud? I mean, native application or solution? What can we expect in the evolving market nowadays?
Yeah, that's what's the future of cloud? Well, I think the two main things are, and that's, I mean, if you're really looking forward and as it impacts entire industries, the two things I think are that cloud computing, especially software as a service, is going to totally replace, well, in the long run, all existing applications, and anything that you have currently, like today, will be a SaaS application in the future. That's very likely, unless you are a cloud provider yourself, and more people are a cloud provider than they think they are. Like any bank, really, as I gave you the example of ING, banks are really a cloud provider, and they start to think like that, especially ING. So that's one thing. Then that's the current application. The future, that's one side of the future. The other side is actually, I find it's more interesting, is what is the stuff that we don't do yet because really or don't do extensively because it really wasn't possible up till recently. And a couple of the examples that come to mind, and Sudhakar mentioned them already in one of his slides, is big data, and related to that, Internet of Things. Why big data? Well, the interesting thing about big data is, well, it is big, but it's analytic, which means that it's not like real-time processing, although it starts to become like that as well. You have fluctuating workloads, like, okay, let's crunch a couple of petabytes. Now, that's going to take a few hours on like a few thousand machines. That workload is cloud native, so to say. It talks so directly to the cloud essential characteristics that's almost impossible to do that in-house. By extension, if you look at Internet of Things, these things are everywhere. They're really playing to the broad network access, as well as having very fluctuating, potentially, volumes. Once again, talking to the strengths of cloud. DevOps is the third one, although that's not an application in itself. It's more like a philosophy. You cannot properly do DevOps if you don't have a good underlying infrastructure and platforms that are totally scalable and totally self-provisioned. If you don't have that, then it's not going to fly. You're not going to get the feature velocity. So, just summing up, our existing application set will very likely move to SaaS, or most of it, or you are the cloud provider. And the new stuff will be stuff like big data and other things that really are cloud native applications. I think that's a summary. We don't have much time left, so I'd love to go on this for another hour or so. But
I have the last question for Sudhakar, and that is, how often one person need to reskill? So cloud is evolving, and we can say easily that what is true 2 years ago today is not valid anymore. But how often you think is important to take a new training and to get a refresh?
Every 6 months.
Yeah, actually, okay. So basically, as I would like to add to a little bit of Peter's thoughts, he did mention the big data develops. We can also look at certain other emerging prospects where the cloud interacts with several areas, such as cybersecurity. We have even data analytics and machine learning. So these are also areas where more training and certification and expertise is required. And moving on to your particular question, so as the technology is evolving rapidly, and as you said, 2 years back, what existed has now been outdated. Yes, we need to keep updated, upgrade ourselves regularly into the various advancements in technology. For example, now a new standard for application execution environments is seen to be containers as against virtual machines. So we need to know what containers are, what containers have advantages over virtual machines. Typically, like containers can be easily migrated among groups and facilitate continuous delivery, or they're much lighter than virtual machines, which raises hardware utilization rates and can improve economics. Also, they can start much more quickly than virtual machines, which enable rapid instantiation. So things of these kinds and the evolving nature of virtualization, where software-defined networking, network functions, virtualization are all keeping pace with them, requires us to periodically upgrade ourselves, going into more repeated certifications or learning concepts of these new technologies. Basically, yeah, these are some of the points that I would like to focus on while taking up retraining or upgrading myself to the latest in technology.
Okay, thank you very much, Dhaka. And Peter, do you have something to add to this, or we can wrap it up and close this webinar for today?
Well, I have a ton of things to add, but let's leave it at that. If people are interested in pursuing this discussion, then there should be a way around this. They should dive into the training, into our ongoing discussions and dialogue, conversations with the market as to how this is evolving. It is a very exciting time in IT, and there's great opportunity to really get back to the forefront of how businesses are developing and progressing in their respective areas. So we're looking forward to the feedback on this session and more questions that as they may arise. For me, it was a pleasure doing this, and I enjoyed the collaboration with Sudhakar and Tristano and all the great questions that we were getting from the audience. Over to you.
Yes, even I did enjoy this session and did get some insights from the questions as well as from my co-contributor, Peter, and I look forward to the feedback as well.